Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Do you think about the government spying on you? Are they watching us? Listening to us on our phones? Accessing our internet history? What are they looking for when they're spying on us? And why are they spying on us? From the Culpeper spy ring and individuals like Nathan Hale during the American Revolution, to today's top secret, high-tech covert intelligence operations, strategic intelligence operations have played a key role throughout the history of the United States. Today, we're exploring the real history of American intelligence. Not the Hollywood version, but the complex and often unsettling reality.
Our guest is Jeff Rogg, historian and author of the newly published The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence. Jeff traces how intelligence grew from a handful of wartime spies into sprawling agencies that shape foreign policy, domestic politics, and the boundaries of personal freedom. We dig into the origins of surveillance, the rise of secrecy as a political weapon, and why these hidden systems matter more than ever in the digital age. So, if you've ever wondered where the line is between protecting a country and watching its citizens, keep listening. Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Chandi. It's really great to be with you.
To kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to study intelligence and intelligence history?
Sure, and it's a great question. A lot of the people that are in the field of intelligence studies or intelligence history tend to be former intelligence practitioners. That's one of the differences. I actually think in my case, it can be a strength, it can be a weakness. In my case, I think it was a strength because view intelligence history differently. So I sort of stumbled into it. I went to undergrad as a classics major. And in case anyone today didn't know, there are not a lot of jobs out there for you. And just by really an accident, an injury, actually, I was playing rugby in college and I was injured my senior year. And so my dad suggested, why don't I go to law school? It wasn't my first choice of what I wanted to do. I really had always been interested in national security, and 9/11 happened when I was a freshman and I thought about joining the military. And that's actually what happened. So I went to law school. I worked for the Army JAG Corps between my first and second years of law school. And I decided that I used to joke it was too much law, not enough Army. And so after law school, I enlisted in the military and I wanted to do a very particular job. And so I went through the assessment and selection process for that job. And down the course's pipeline, I got injured again. That was drawback of having 3 knee surgeries from rugby, even before the military. And so I didn't know what to do. And a friend of mine from the military actually was at Georgetown for undergrad. And I looked at their graduate program and they had the security studies program. And as part of that program, you need to choose a concentration. And so this is where, I literally just looked at the concentration options. I just thought security studies meant security studies. I was like, oh no, I have to concentrate in something. And one of the options was intelligence. And I just felt like it's something that people are naturally curious about. You want to know what's going on behind the scenes. All the other concentrations, to me, it was like, okay, national security policy, military policy. Okay, but what are we doing in intelligence? And so that's what drew me to it. I eventually then got a PhD where I had to do military and diplomatic history because there really isn't specific coursework designed around intelligence history. And so I sort of forged my own path in my PhD. And ultimately, my focus was American intelligence history for my dissertation. And so it was quite a journey to get there. And now that I look back on it, and there were a lot of places where it was like, did I take the right road or not? And so all's well that ends well. And it's really a rewarding field to be in, especially because I don't think I'm alone when I say this, but people just want to know what's going on in intelligence.
They do. And of course we do. And that's why we wanted to talk to you. We've had the conversations about intelligence, and Chandi has mentioned, obviously, I'm hoping jokingly, wanting to be a spy. But
I was.
No, you're serious.
But not anymore.
It's fine.
Mm-hmm.
You know too much now? Are you like the woman who
maybe
knew too
we'll
much?
learn what intelligence actually is from Jeff. But I feel like there's certain decisions, I don't know, maybe just ethically.
So, Jeff, your new book is The Spy and the State, and it just came out. Can you tell us a little bit about it and why that particular area of intelligence?
So one of the interesting points about it, first, when we talk about spies, so Chani, when you said you want to be a spy, this is something where I might catch some heat from my own group, the Intel Studies group. So technically, when we speak technically, the spy is the person that's recruited to give information on their own country or organization. What we call the people who recruit those spies is intelligence officers. And like I say in the book, I knew that people in the field might be like, well, why are you calling it the spy in the state? You really mean the intelligence officer in the state, but it just doesn't have the same ring to it. And there's actually another reason, which is the foundation for the book is my contribution to intelligence studies. So aside from the history, I'm an academic, and academics look for a contribution to the field. And so besides the history itself, my contribution was this idea of civil intelligence relations, because when we look at what goes on in the military, we often will talk about civil military relations. Does a general speak out against the president? Is that good civil military relations or not? What I noticed during the research for the book, for the past couple of years in this country, we've seen some tensions between the elected leadership and the intelligence community. And so my contribution is the idea of civil intelligence relations. And so I borrowed here from a very famous author, groundbreaking work, Samuel Huntington, who wrote The Soldier and the State, which is the foundational book for civil and military relations. So I borrowed similar concepts and ideas and applied them to intelligence. But what I found along the way is the idea of civil intelligence relations, including some of its themes, actually helps us understand American intelligence history. So I used this concept that I was sort of working on. And what I discovered was it was actually better for me to write the history of American intelligence than write about civil intelligence relations as its own subject.
And like you said, spy just has a better ring than intelligence officer. You're speaking to the masses.
That's right.
As an academic, that's important. And, you open up the book saying that someone might be watching us right now. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I think that we all have the suspicion that someone's collecting information on us. And by someone, I mean organizations, whether it's intelligence services, governments, whether it's U.S. government or foreign government or actor, private corporations, certainly. I mean, we hand over volumes of information every day to private companies. Every time you use your phone or an app or you sign a user agreement, you're handing over information. And so, like I say in the book, I'm not really trying to cause alarm. I just want people to be aware, if they aren't already, that intelligence is all around us and it's not going anywhere. And for that reason, we probably should study it and understand it better than we have, because unfortunately, most of what the public learns about intelligence is through, and this isn't always bad, there's a very good journalism, but it can be sensationalized. We also tend to have conspiracy theories about intelligence and organizations like the CIA, or we're worried about what government like China or Russia is doing with intelligence. And so my idea is it's better that we understand it today because it's not going anywhere. The intelligence challenges we face in the United States and the world for that matter are only growing and getting worse. And so we all need to be more informed about intelligence.
When most people hear the word intelligence, they do think of spies and secret missions, but how do you define
It's interesting because intelligence can be a few different things. Intelligence can be a process in which you collect information or analyze information. It can be a product, in other words, an intelligence product itself. So the President's Daily Brief is the flagship product of the U.S. intelligence community. And it can also be an organization like the CIA, for instance. So this is ways in intelligence studies we talk about intelligence being many different things. And so, to me, though, what it is, it's a secret sphere of activity that states use to understand and influence and shape events. And the reason why that I want to distinguish something important is, so now there's an idea of business intelligence, private sector intelligence, competitive intelligence. But what I'm talking about in the book, more so than anything, is national security intelligence. So intelligence as we traditionally understand it.
Someone who knows the history of intelligence, can you talk about the beginnings of intelligence in America and what is this shadow war that you mentioned?
Probably am not supposed to say I have favorite chapters, but one of my favorite chapters to research and write and it's one of my favorite periods of American history, is the American Revolution. And what I liked most about it is it establishes so many of the themes that keep reappearing throughout American intelligence history. And so one of the ways that I start the book is we as a country tend to have a lot of conspiracy theories and be conspiracy minded. Well, during the American Revolution, one of the reasons why we even had the revolution was there was a very common idea, almost a conspiracy theory. The great American historian Bernard Bailyn talks about this, that there was a conspiracy in the British government to undermine the rights of the American colonists. And so then, as I explain, our revolution kind of started as a conspiracy. Small groups of patriots, including the Sons of Liberty and an offshoot of them called the Mechanics, met and basically, created a revolution out of nothing. And one of the ways they did that was another intelligence function, which is propaganda. So we don't like to think of Thomas Paine and the famous pamphleteers as the time as propagandists, but in a way, that's what they were doing because a considerable population in the United States didn't support the revolution. They felt it's good enough to still be part of the UK. And so fascinating because basically our own little conspiracy, as a spark, lit this fuse that exploded into a revolution. And during that revolution, every type of intelligence you can imagine was practiced by people that we hold in very high regard as our founders.
That's actually really interesting because I think that is an important part of just American history and the way we our outlook on our history itself and how we view our interactions even still with England. Being taught as a kid, it's still part of what you're taught. And I was just thinking about it too. In the town that I grew up in, there is elementary school. It's named after
awesome.
Nathan
I started
Hale.
the book with Nathan Hale.
I thought that was interesting. I mean, I knew a little bit, but it was kind of cool.
So
to
Hale, I like his example because to me, he represents the tensions that Americans have always had with intelligence. Hale himself, Yale graduate, he was, ahead of his time in some ways. He argued in favor of equal education and opportunity for women. He argued against slavery as an institution. He's a very admirable and forthright young man. That may not be the best makings for a spy when you have to conceal your identity and lie. And in fact, some of his friends tried to convince him not to spy, and the reason why is it was considered dishonorable. And so Hale, though, says something very interesting according to the records, where he says to his fellow Yalean classmate and a captain also in the Continental Army, William Hull, who says, we're gentlemen, we don't spy. Hale says, anything necessary to the public good becomes honorable. So again, that itself is a very honorable thing to say. However, Hale himself isn't a very good spy. And why would he be? Because we don't have professional intelligence officers at the time. You don't have people who've been trained to spy. It's amateurs. And so Hale doesn't really use a very good cover as a school teacher. He keeps the documents that he was using to record information on his person, and he reveals his mission to the famous Robert Rogers of Rogers Rangers fame during the 7 Years' War in a tavern. And what again I like about this is that this captures this tension in American history where spying is considered just un-American and dishonorable, but we still need to do it. And so we have this internal conflict over it. And, so at different points in American history, what I'll say is intelligence or espionage is considered at best a necessary evil and at worst an unnecessary evil. Yeah, so I actually make the argument in the book, and I ran it by some friends who were intelligence officers because the way I first wrote it might have caused offense with America's spies, America's intelligence officers, because what I said is something that you don't see very often. One thing that I kept hearing or reading or seeing is, at different points, officials will say, they try and reassure the public and say, there's nothing un-American about intelligence. There's nothing un-American about espionage. My thing is studying it, I'm like, everything about it's un-American. That's why we have so much conflict with it. It causes the turmoil because we know that it goes against our principles as a country to keep secrets from each other. It's an institution of national security, is anti-American, and early Americans didn't like the idea of a standing army or a professional military. Well, spying is even worse as far as what our principles are as a country. So when I kept seeing how intelligence officers or policymakers, elected officials would say, don't worry, intelligence is un-American, I don't think it helps. I think what actually is more constructive is to say it is un-American. That's the tension. It doesn't mean the people who do it are. And in fact, some of the best Americans I know are my friends who were in the intelligence community. But what it means is that how should a constitutional republic like the United States incorporate and use something like intelligence as an institution or instrument of national security? How do we work with that even when it goes against our principles, our laws, our highest ideals as a country, knowing that it's still necessary? That's the real nub at the heart of American intelligence history.
Can you tell us what role intelligence has played in politics and international relations?
Well, so those could be different things. Now, one of the most controversial areas of American intelligence history, and it certainly is today, and it was something that I had to tackle carefully in the book, was the mixing of intelligence and politics, and especially when it comes to domestic partisan politics. Whenever intelligence becomes a piece of it, because it's convenient, right? Politicians are politicians. They will use intelligence if it helps them politically. That's a misuse of intelligence, though. And it's a dangerous one because of the secrecy that surrounds intelligence. And it makes the intelligence community look more conspiratorial. An interesting poll that I saw said a very high number, like 50% of Americans thought that the U.S. intelligence community was affecting American elections. At different points in American history, I document where intelligence has either spied on American elected leaders, which is one of the worst violations that you can have of civil intelligence relations, or where elected leaders have misused or abused intelligence as well. And the reason why that was a theme that I thought was important to draw out in the book is because we're seeing so much of it today. And it's doing the same thing that it always did, which is pulling the country apart. And it's also creating distrust between the intelligence community, the American people, and the U.S. government. I want there to be trust between those three pillars of American civil intelligence relations: the intelligence community, the government, and the American people, the public. So what I conclude, based on finding and trying to document as many episodes of intelligence and politics mixing as I can, is that regardless of the intentions of the people, whether it's the president, the intelligence community, members of Congress, members of the press, and civil society, mixing intelligence and politics has always hurt the intelligence community, the government, and the country. And so that's the thing that I want listeners and readers to understand today is we have very passionate disagreements over the current U.S. government and the intelligence community, the relationship between the two. What I observe when it comes to intelligence is drawing intelligence into that absolute fire is not helpful. So my whole thing is let's try and keep intelligence out of politics as much as possible.
How does it interact with international relations? Is it the same essentially, or we know that it happens, but like, does it? Obviously, it can hurt,
Or it can help it as well.
relations.
The opposite is true, where just because we don't want intelligence to get involved in domestic politics, we get intelligence involved in foreign politics. And there's very good reasons why. One of the things that intelligence is designed to do is provide information advantage. In other words, you know something about not just adversaries, but allies as well. It helps you with your own decision making. This is why there's a saying, there's no such thing as a friendly intelligence service. There's certain allies that we have, and there's certain intelligence organizations that our intelligence community works with more closely than others. But even they will probably want to get information. I mean, that's the gist of it. That's what intelligence does. However, going back to the larger question of what it does in international relations is, again, what you're trying to do is collect information, analyze it, and provide your best judgment to your own policymakers so then they can make good foreign policy judgments. And then there's an active component to this as well. This is, covert action, and this is where things can often get very controversial. But you also will use intelligence organizations to try and influence, rather than just collect information, actively get involved. And of course, we've seen at different points in American history where the U.S. intelligence community has gotten involved with coups in foreign countries, trying to overthrow governments. It's been involved in targeted killing, more recently during the global war on terror, during the Cold War, and even before the Cold War. One of the things that I'd say gets the U.S. intelligence community in the most trouble is when our collection operations stray from just targeting foreign states and foreign people to back home, like the boomerang effect, where all of a sudden we're spying in the United States itself. Again, all of this is to say, though, intelligence has a very necessary role to play in national security. It's as necessary as Nathan Hale realized it was. However, it will always be controversial. And unfortunately, when intelligence fails, that's what we tend to see the most of. You don't really hear as much about the successes, so you don't really have a balanced record sheet.
And you mentioned that there were moments throughout U.S. history that intelligence has played a role in how they're shaped. So are there any specific moments that
So one of the ones that I
about?
start with in the book, and this goes to the political piece, is intelligence helped form the two-party system that we have in this country. At the time, it was called the first-party system because it was the first-party system we had. And the intelligence activities that were going on, and particularly the controversial ones involving the Federalists, who were sort of pro-British, and the Democratic Republicans, that's an odd name today to combine those two parties, but that's what we called them at the time, who were pro-French. There was allegations of conspiracy and collusion and spying. It drove the wedge between the two emerging parties even deeper and helped create that system. So this is a very long-lasting legacy. And besides that, I say intelligence didn't only shape American history, it shaped the United States. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which was famous as an exploratory expedition, was also very much a reconnaissance of the country, because at the time, early American presidents and Jefferson had to contend with the problem that you still had the old empires of Europe with a geographical stake in North America. And he wanted to know, how big is this country? Where are the different populations? Of course, westward expansion becomes a theme of American history. And so we think of it as just like this harmless expedition. They were very brave, but there was also an intelligence purpose behind it. One of my favorite cases that I cover in the book, because you don't hear about it that often, is we annexed Hawaii ultimately as part of arguably what we would call today a covert action operation in the 1890s. Another reason for that was because of British interest there and Japanese interest there. And the United States was expanding and we needed coaling ports. That's what Pearl Harbor started as, a coaling port for the U.S. Navy in the 1880s. And so it was a covert action operation that involved the Dole family, the Dole pineapples and the Dole fruit company. And ultimately that resulted in the annexation of Hawaii. So again, intelligence literally shaped the United States in some ways.
You describe intelligence as inherently un-American.
I would say that is something that raises eyebrows, especially among intelligence officers. I had a conversation with a former intelligence officer who disagrees with that. That's fine. But I think it's, again, the disagreement is based on more of an instinctual, but we do it. Right. But just because we do it doesn't mean it's American. It's but we've always done it. And George Washington did it. Yes. And the fact that he did it actually caused a degree of discomfort among Americans, which I illustrate in a book, James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Spy, which I think is a fantastic piece of American literature. But in the book, he portrays George Washington as a spy master. And so one of the things I did as part of my research for the book is I didn't just read and talk about the book. I read reviews of the book at the time. And American reviewers, some of them were horrified that Washington was portrayed as having anything to do with spies. And so again, going back to the idea of whether intelligence is un-American or not, well, you tell me, because just because Washington did it doesn't mean that Americans at the time would have approved of it. And one of the reasons that the founders kept it secret, didn't include it in the Constitution, even though it was a big part of the American Revolution, is they knew it was controversial. They were around Nathan Hale. They were surrounded by people who would have said, this is ungentlemanly, we don't do this, this is beneath us. And in fact, at different other points in early American history and later American history, members of Congress talk about, the dangers of espionage and how we don't want a spy system in this country. And so again, I feel like I'm on very firm ground to say the profession of intelligence, not the people who do it, but the profession, what it involves, is inherently un-American. That's the whole problem. I'm not trying to say that the people are. I'm trying to say that by understanding that, then at least you understand the key source of tension when an intelligence scandal hits the news and the American people are horrified and the intelligence community is stumbling to say, but. Now you understand why this problem keeps happening in American history.
I think some people wonder for themselves, if they're capable of doing that too. People are probably actually more willing to do things that they don't think that they would
that's the
do.
Interesting thing is, so I don't know how willing they would be in practice, if it was face to face, but what they're willing to support is what really I find remarkable. So I look at public polling, what the American people find acceptable based on what the threat is. And what's remarkable is we raised a lot of protests to some of the intelligence operations that went on during the global war on terror. and there's longhand and shorthand, but the longhand is enhanced interrogation techniques. The shorthand, people would say, is torture. And what's fascinating is Americans are still divided over whether they actually consider some of the things done torture or not. And not only are they divided over whether they consider it torture, they're divided when you ask them, is it okay to torture to prevent something like a terrorist attack? Because a substantial number of Americans say, well, yeah, if you're going to stop a terrorist attack, it's fine. And in fact, with students, I sort of test them, because this is where the ethics comes into play, by asking them questions about, like, okay, give like the Baltimore scenario. There's a nuclear weapon in Baltimore. You captured the terrorist suspect. Do you torture the person to stop the attack? This isn't a situation where the students get to caveat and say, oh, well, but what about this and what about that? No. It's a yes or no. Do you or don't you? You can even start to get more extreme and say, what if you're going to lose the person you love most in the world? We as Americans are much more willing to tolerate things that, the funny thing is we're supposed to hold the intelligence community to a standard of American ideals, but often it's the reverse that happens. Americans abandon their own principles when we feel threatened or fearful, and we give sweeping mandates to the intelligence community. And then as soon as we feel safe again, we're like, well, you went too far. It's what we asked for, though, at the time. And the polling is reflective of that.
Speaking of the creation of government agencies, let's start off with like the FBI. So how did, intelligence play a role in the creation of the FBI?
I really like that example. And I think it's an overlooked part of American history. So the fascinating thing is, before the FBI, and the FBI itself is called the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, in Congress in 1935. Before that, it was called the BOI, the Bureau of Investigation. And that was started in 1908. So the question is though, what existed before that? Who was doing federal law enforcement? Who was doing domestic intelligence? Well, the U.S. Secret Service was. The Secret Service started in 1865. I actually have a copy of the letter creating the Secret Service in July 1865. Allegedly, it was Lincoln's last act. Like, he actually approved it. The day he was shot at Ford's Theater, he had approved the creation of a Secret Service. But it was created to do anti-counterfeiting, which was a big problem during the Civil War. And this is one of the fascinating things, and where I worry about like how intelligence kind of takes on a mind of its own. So the Secret Service is created as a law enforcement organization under the Treasury Department to investigate financial crimes, basically. However, it also gets into the game of protecting the president of the United States, because in the 1890s, there's a lot of labor unrest, there's gangsters, there's organized crime, there's threats against the president of the United States. So the Secret Service, in order to protect the president, has to collect information. And so the Secret Service, sort of against its mandate, why it was founded, it starts doing domestic intelligence. And during the Spanish-American War in 1898, it's doing a lot of domestic intelligence, including, and this is something where I talk about we, the American people, as our own worst enemy. I have letters to the head of the Secret Service, John Wilkie at the time, to President McKinley even, where Americans are writing letters reporting their fellow Americans, their neighbors, their employees, relatives, Catholic priests, because they feared they were Spanish spies. So the Secret Service is in the law enforcement game and the intelligence game. So it's doing both. Then in the first decade of the 20th century, a scandal happens, a political scandal. The Secret Service is caught spying on members of Congress for the Teddy Roosevelt administration. And Congress naturally investigates it. And what I found fascinating is, this is again where the public comes into play. Congress basically says, we need law enforcement. We do need a national law enforcement organization, but we don't want a domestic spy system. So Congress and the American people, and I have news reports at the time, are saying, yes, we need law enforcement, but we don't want domestic intelligence. So the Secret Service, Congress goes after the Secret Service, and now you don't have a law enforcement organization. So the Bureau of Investigation is created within the Department of Justice by the Attorney General Charles Bonaparte in 1908, and it starts doing both law enforcement and domestic intelligence. And the long-term trend that's very important with understanding this history is, we're different than other common law countries like the UK or Australia, because they have domestic intelligence services without law enforcement powers. And then they have law enforcement organizations. We give both of those responsibilities to one organization. It's the FBI. And the FBI itself only got those two functions through bureaucratic competition with other organizations and kind of like against congressional intent. Now, Congress down the road has actually legislated and re-legislated the FBI as both a law enforcement organization and an intelligence organization. But I think that was a mistake. And I think it's one that we still have today, because combining law enforcement and domestic intelligence, not a good idea. And I also think it leads to political intelligence scandals like we saw before the first Trump administration with Crossfire Hurricane.
Is it really possible to have this intelligence system, which is secretive, to coexist with a democratic and transparent society?
Like I say in the book, the question was never if the United States would have intelligence organizations and use intelligence. The question is how it would do so, because you need it. Again, military diplomatic history, I work on contemporary policy and strategy, national security policy and strategy. So I'm not just an intel person or just an intel historian. I'm very contemporary focused in my own research on national security issues. You need intelligence. So it does give advantages. It's not always decisive and it can lead you astray too. But the problem, though, is the balancing act. My concern is, and this is something that was also motivating me to write the book, is we need to be more aware of intelligence in the future than we have been in the past, because it's just in everyday life. So if there are things that we can recognize in the past that sort of rattle you or make you feel uncomfortable, get ready, because they're probably only going to get worse in the future, especially when it pertains to domestic intelligence and surveillance of the American people, because our Constitution was created at a point in time, and the founders had an idea about eavesdropping, and that's why the Bill of Rights was created, with no unreasonable search and seizure. They never could have contemplated the capabilities that American intelligence organizations and the NSA, for instance, have today, and rivals as well. And so our Constitution is already under stress. It has been in the past, and it's going to be even more so in the future. And along with that is the American way of life. So if there's things in my book that make you uncomfortable, then you better form an opinion about it and figure out ways to exercise that opinion, because this debate about what intelligence is doing to change our world, we need to have it.
You show how the American public often enables bad intelligence policy during moments of fear. Why do we keep falling into that pattern?
I think it's natural to an extent. What wouldn't you do to save yourself, instinctually, or to save the people you love most in the world? Amplify that to the national level, like scale that fear, that hysteria. And this idea of democracy, but going back to even Thucydides writing during the Peloponnesian War about Athenian democracy, democracies can succumb to fear and demagoguery from politicians and the worser instincts of, the masses. And so in some ways, I think this is also, Thucydides says something very interesting. He has this line where basically in better times, human beings can act better. But when we're afraid, or, he says at war is a rough master, and it lowers people to the level of basically their condition at that time. When all is good and we're happy and we feel safe, it's easy to have high ideals and to lecture other countries about how they should or shouldn't conduct a war or behave. But when you are frightened, or your people are being killed, or it's your neighbors, your friends, your family, what wouldn't you do to protect them? And so to me, it's sort of logical, but it's also a tendency that we need to sometimes be more restrained with. In other words, what I mean by that is, extreme moments call for extreme responses sometimes. I understand that. And I was in the military, so I think internally I have a certain level of acceptance for the use of force for protection purposes. But sometimes it's hard to actually realize what level of force you need or what level of response you need. And so I guess, at different points in American intelligence history, our national response and our national instincts and our reactionary nature was out of proportion to what the actual threat was. And having that realization, being more realistic, the more you know, the more courageous you can be. Or the more you can kind of have a little bit more of a moderated response, because it's this is bad. It could be worse. What might be worse is our response. This is tough stuff. I'm going to make everyone at some point in the book question something or probably be a little bit upset. I love boxing as a sport. So there's a great boxing referee, Joe Cortez, who would always tell fighters before the fight, I'm fair, but I'm firm. That's how I am with American intelligence history. I'll tell you when the American people have gone wrong, when our government and presidents and Congress have gone wrong, and then when the intelligence community has gone wrong.
On the intelligence side, people who counteract or, mention this is why I do this, they can be defensive in a way, rightfully so, because how else can you do the job?
Well, I should add too, I'm an academic, and there's a general trend that you'll notice when people write about intelligence. Journalists and academics have, in the past at least, tended to be more critical of the intelligence community. And intelligence officers have tended to be more defensive. Look, it's your team. You defend your team, right? I'm in a different place, I think, because a little bit of my background, because I do have friends in the intelligence community, and that humanizes them in a way where, what do you think these people are? You think they're like conspiring behind the scenes to like overthrow your rights or be a shadow government? At least in my associations, no, they aren't. They just want to go home. Literally normal people who do an extraordinary job. And even beyond that, what I will say too is when I have these conversations, either in professional military education, with intelligence students, a lot of times when I talk about things like civil liberties and constitutional law and the American way of life, they are very concerned about it themselves. More so sometimes, like I said, when you look at the polling, when I talk to a class and say like, well, what should we do in this situation? Your family's at risk or something. And they're like, go get them. A lot of times intelligence officers are very thoughtful and cautious themselves. The problem is, bureaucracies don't work that way, and governments don't work that way, and democracies don't work that way. And so again, on a case-by-case basis, I think that my proximity to some people in the intelligence community makes me a little more sympathetic. And so, like I said, that doesn't stop me from criticizing them, and I do that quite a bit in the book, but I also defend them when they deserve to be defended. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
As the public, we like spies, we like this spy culture. But do you think, the portrayals of how intelligence and intelligence officers in TV shows or movies help or hurt the public understanding?
That's a great question that I haven't heard yet. Public portrayals. Generally, I would say they're unrealistic. Now, whether that hurts or helps, it depends on what the intent is. Like, in other words, if you want the public to support intelligence, they probably would be bored to death if they understood that a lot of intelligence involves writing. I mean, even operations officers, case officers have to write reports about meetings that they have. It's a lot of writing. I do think that assuming that all intelligence is Jason Bourne or James Bondish, and they're like collectors and paramilitaries and analysts, and maybe if we didn't sensationalize intelligence, we would have more realistic expectations of intelligence. Because I think one of the issues that I try and tackle is Americans need to understand, and this includes policymakers, because government officials often harbor the same illusion. I'll just ask the CIA to do something and that'll solve the problem. Intelligence can't solve a failed policy to begin with. And yet policymakers try and do that all the time. They come up with a policy that's just not going to work, and then they're like, the intelligence community will fix that problem. That's not how it works. I think we need to have a better and more realistic understanding of the uses and limits of intelligence and national security. And that includes the analytical role of it, which is that not all systems are geared towards producing analysis. I think ours itself is geared towards producing information, meaning collection. We are a collection-dominant system. We are obsessed with collecting every scrap of information we can. But, what intelligence ultimately is also responsible for is providing decision makers with their best judgment and information that they otherwise wouldn't have that might change their decision. So that's important. And I think, unfortunately, that's also boring probably to a lot of people, which is why you don't really see movies about analysts, although Jack Ryan. But I think the real story behind intelligence is that, perception isn't necessarily reality. And the other funny thing that I document in the book is even the intelligence community can sometimes suffer from the same schizophrenia in terms of, are we more analytical? Are we more operational? And even within operations, are we more on the paramilitary and covert action side, or are we more on the espionage and collection side? And you really do see this in the CIA. The CIA has had a divided organizational culture since it was created, and even before when it was the OSS. That's something that I say the American people in the CIA sort of share, a sort of schizophrenia over like, what should we focus on? What is intelligence predominantly? What does it mean to us?
Yeah, I don't want to watch something about someone journaling and debriefing about their meeting with a boss. I want to see them jumping out of a plane.
You know what? Challenge accepted. That should be what I do next. Is I need to make like the interesting movie on, a presidential daily brief that creates a crisis or something. Like, there you go.
Are there any shows or movies that even remotely get intelligence or spying?
Oh, that's a good question. One show that I did like for a while when it was on The Americans but this is Russian espionage in the United States, but involves counterintelligence too. I also like Turn, Washington Spies on AMC.
No, that was good.
It's sensationalized, but one thing that I like about that show is because it's back when it was, they couldn't have all the weird gadgetry to really exaggerate. And it doesn't really do a lot of good to pretend that the people are superheroes like James Bond, who has this crazy watch and knows MMA and Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu, and they didn't have that. So the other thing that I liked about it too is, the Culper ring actually managed to survive intact without being discovered. And you see some of the ways that they did like dead drops and signaling each other. And so now, is intelligence far more sophisticated and that means more risky and you're less able to do it that way today? Certainly. But, you asked for like something more realistic, and it's like, yeah, you use covers and you are careful with who you leave information with or how you signal people, and does someone know that you're a spy or not, the counterintelligence angle. The other thing that I think I should admit is I grew up watching all the sensational stuff. I still like watching great spy and covert action movies, and the CIA actually, I think they unofficially consulted on like Zero Dark 30, for instance. I like watching those programs and movies myself. I don't always think they're the best representatives in terms of educating the American public about intelligence.
You mentioned this in your book, but intelligence has been used against minorities and dissidents. And can you tell us why?
Well, one of the reasons why is when you go to war, for instance, who's the country you're going to war with? So, for example, during the American Revolution, intelligence was used against the Tories, the pro-British, the pro-monarchist American colonists themselves. And there were a considerable amount. Historians don't always know, but people say a quarter, maybe even as much as 40 or 50% of American colonists were still pro-British. And we were using counterintelligence against them. John Jay, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, by the way, was involved in counterintelligence, which really, there was a committee that became sort of the judge, jury, not exactly executioner, but that was doing things that lawyers wouldn't accept today. And we were doing it against our fellow Americans, and we were doing it against, I guess you would call them, a political minority, and that was the people allied with the British. During the Civil War, you had what were called the Copperheads, who were the pro-Confederate Democrats in the Union, and intelligence was used against them. I went to law school. There's a very famous constitutional law case called Ex parte Milligan, and it's about prosecuting American citizens while courts are still open. And what I found out is intelligence played a big role in the course of those events, and it was intelligence used against Copperheads. And then during the First World War, I already mentioned the Spanish-American War, people who were Catholic, people of Spanish descent, we were fighting Spain. It kind of made sense. During the First World War, it's a little bit different. A colleague of mine at Ohio State has written a lot about this, Cam Givens, and it wasn't just the Germans we targeted, because there was also a view that racial minorities, so African Americans, Mexican Americans, certainly after the Zimmerman telegram, where we have evidence that there's collusion between the German and Mexican governments, but also religious minorities, Jews, they were all seen to be vulnerable populations that the Germans would target with propaganda. Vulnerable in a way where either they would become spies or you could have race riots. And then after that, we had, a switch from focusing on German Americans and Eastern Europeans to socialists and communists, sort of a political minority. So on the one hand, during a war, you kind of look at who you're fighting and you say, well, do we have any of those people here? So let's look at those people very carefully. And that kind of makes sense off the top of your head. The problem, though, is, again, we've also seen throughout American history times where, and, during the Cold War, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted by the FBI. People who are just troublesome. Are they working on behalf of a foreign government? Are they unwitting agents, who are being either fed propaganda or being manipulated by a foreign intelligence adversary, a foreign intelligence threat? So this is what we do. We have a very unfortunate history of using intelligence against political, ethnic, racial, religious minorities. And we still sort of do to this day. Again, this is where I say we need to be cautious and more realistic about the threat that the population poses, because again, we're talking about targeting in mass versus targeting individuals. Some individuals are targeted, but a lot of times in American intelligence history, you see groups who are targeted by intelligence. The, good news, bad news here today, at least, is you still see some, I think recently there's concerns that political donors, people of certain political parties, political candidates have been targeted by the intelligence community. That isn't good for democracy. So I hope that one of the things that we're coming around to is that we have to be careful how we use intelligence, and particularly when we use it at home. I wish that I could say that there's a well-defined border between what happens overseas and what happens at home. That wall has collapsed. We just need to understand, though, that wall is gone. There isn't really a barrier between foreign and domestic intelligence. So we have to be so careful about what we're willing to do overseas and how it affects us at home. Because again, the American way of life is changing due to intelligence. And I do worry as an intelligence historian, when I read the history and see where we've been and then see where we're headed, I worry about that direction a lot.
Do you think we expect too much from intelligence? Are we trying to make it predict the unpredictable?
Absolutely. If you listened very closely a few weeks ago, you'd hear us intelligence academics and studies people like collectively screaming around the world because apparently President Trump published something on, maybe it was Truth Social that made its way to X, saying the purpose of intelligence is to predict. No, it's not. No one can predict the future. I wouldn't go to a tarot card reader, and I wouldn't go to an intelligence officer to predict the future either. An intelligence officer's job is to provide their best analytic judgment. And sometimes that analytic judgment might not actually be all that good, either because the analyst themselves isn't, or even beyond that, because I don't want to necessarily say intelligence analysts are bad. They're often really super smart people. I've had professors, friends who are intelligence analysts, and they're brilliant. But again, it's a human judgment, and they can be wrong. Now, they do go through multiple peer review, so there's eyes on what other analysts are saying. But even the collective judgment of the intelligence community can be wrong. And so I think that's a big common misperception. And if you ask people, it's like, well, you predict the future. No one can do that. The other thing that I established in the book is the intelligence community is generally pretty good when it comes to predicting trends. In other words, big, important trends, it's like, hey, this is going on and you should pay attention to it. The problem is when it comes to saying that something specific is going to happen at a certain time in a certain place, now that's a whole lot harder, especially even for the American intelligence community, which has massive resources. You're asking for a level of specifics, and then this other part gets ignored a lot. What if the person they're telling that to has other priorities in mind, or isn't listening, or doesn't want to pay attention, or if you're a president has a different policy and what you're hearing from the intelligence community goes against your preferred policy? Well, then it doesn't even matter if you predicted the future or not. It's not going to it's not going to happen. You're not going to change the outcome. And so we need to understand that intelligence is not in the business of prediction. We also need to understand that just because intelligence says something doesn't mean other people are going to act on it. And even when intelligence is wrong, sometimes we have to ask, how wrong were they? Were they right about the big thing and they missed the small thing? So I know that at different points tonight, it sounds like I'm perhaps too defensive of the intelligence community. It's not defensiveness. It's trying to instill a little realism in people about intelligence. I also think tonight I've been fairly critical of intelligence in a few places too.
Also, your book is interesting because it's not talking about a particular agency like a lot of shows or books do. You're talking about the relationship between intelligence and the public.
Yep. I didn't want to focus only on the intelligence organizations, although I explained how the CIA was created, why it was created, how the public influenced it, who the big actors were. Obviously, Wild Bill Donovan. I talked about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI a lot. So what I really want readers to get out of it is they walk away and they're like, I get it. That's how we got to where we are today. When they see the big themes, issues like, an intelligence coordination problem, 9/11, not collecting the dots. Was it really an intel failure or not? What was the public's role? What was the CIA doing? What was the FBI doing? What was the president doing? What was the Congress doing? And then when we react to that and we create legislation, what were the problems with that? Why can't we fix, even through legislation, or reform to organizations, why are there still just some key problems in intelligence that keep repeating themselves? So, that's really what I want readers to walk away with, is a better understanding of American intelligence. Not just past, though, so they understand what they see in the present, and they're going to do a better job influencing it in the future.
Moving forward, what should we as the public realistically expect and demand from our intelligence agencies?
I'm glad you asked that question because it puts me on the hot seat. I do think that our system is overclassified. There's too many secrets. I think that we haven't done a good job, from the intelligence community hasn't done a good job of being transparent and owning up to failures rather than being forced to. One of the examples that I use towards the end of the book, use much more when talking about it, is this was a recent controversy, but Section 702 of FISA, which is FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, originally created in 1978 to deal with signals intelligence. Even in 1978, what we learned from the Church Committee is that the NSA was really good at listening to people's conversations and storing information. Imagine how much better they are today. So Section 702 in FISA is a section that allows for what should be collection on non-U.S. citizens, targeted collection based on querying certain things. And one of the problems is Congress found out that it had been abused, including that the FBI had queried tens of thousands of bad queries that also included political donors. So it looks like there's a political element to it, and even members of Congress, elected officials, judges. So one of the points I make is, one thing that we should probably hold our intelligence community to is, if you mess up, own it first. Don't let us find out about it. I mean, that's just a good policy in life. If you're like a parent, you tell your kid, I don't want to find out about this from your teacher. I want you to have the integrity to tell me. Because when Section 702 of FISA was being debated, every national security official will tell you, this is very important for national security. We need this capability. And my response is then don't abuse it in the first place. It doesn't look very good to tell the public, hey, I need you to trust me with something that I already breached your trust with. And then the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which even revealed that the FBI had misused it, has said, well, they're getting better. Now, do I expect the intelligence community to be perfect? No, but I kind of expect them to be more transparent with their failures rather than Congress having to investigate it, a journalist having to leak it. That helps build public trust. And from the public side, we have to be more self-aware about what we're asking the intelligence community to do. And it doesn't really help to say like, oh, go get the terrorists, capture them, torture them, throw them in a country that's going to torture them, only to a couple years later say, well, why did you go that far? Because we asked you to. We were scared and we wanted to be protected. Unfortunately, though, I've sort of hinted at this, these problems are getting worse, not better. The intelligence capabilities are beyond anything that anyone could ever imagine. And now we have competition everywhere. China's competing with the US. Russia's competing with the US. We have Iran and North Korea are still sophisticated in their own, in some ways, in terms of intelligence, or they can pose a threat. Private companies collect more information than governments do in some cases. So how much privacy can the average person, me or you, sitting at home, reasonably expect? Not much. And to me, this is where I'm kind of like an old school American constitutionalist. Privacy is essential to liberty. Just because I say I have nothing to hide, and I know I do, everyone does. That's another game we can play where I'm like, oh, I guarantee you, anyone who says, well, I have nothing to hide. Yeah, you do. We can walk you there. Do you really want to get that specific? But I guarantee you do. Everyone has those skeletons in their closet. But even if you do, 2 points that I'd make is, it's not your prerogative to then say, well, because I'm willing to cede my privacy, you need to as well. And then the other thing is just because even if the entire American collective was like, well, we have nothing to hide, that doesn't mean the government should collect it or have access to it. I mean, that's the whole point of the Constitution. And so, in the introduction to the book, I talk about this, but I ask readers, I want them to ask questions as they read the book, like how much liberty would you trade for security? And even beyond that, not only how much of your own liberty you would trade for security, how much of your neighbor's liberty? Zoe, Chandi, it's not you answering the question for yourself. How much of Zoe's liberty would you trade Chandi for so you feel safer? And vice versa. Because once we start doing that, that's where we start pulling ourselves apart. That's where we start targeting minority groups. That's where we allow the intelligence community to do things that later we regret. This is a self-serving argument. I think intelligence is one of the greatest challenges of our time. For the American people, for the American way of life, for our Constitution, for how we've grown up, intelligence will challenge that in ways that we aren't even completely foreseeable. But I think by studying the history and learning some of the episodes that have bothered us, we're going to be better prepared for them in the future, and we'll have a response ready.
Yeah, I think a lot of things out there are things that are going to emerge in the future. Like they're testing things, they're figuring things out. Well, one question I think I've always had is when you find out that somebody is a spy, that they've kind of betrayed their own country or whatever. I think when I was younger, I always heard treason is punishable by death. Obviously, certain people are still alive.
Class with Professor, he recently passed, Burton Gerber, in January, and he spent 40 years in the CIA. And I remember he asked us one evening, hey, what do you think about people who spy against their country? One of my classmates, and I knew the person for a while because we had been in the same master's program for a while, said they're traitors. And that was kind of the consensus. I raised my hand and I said, it depends. Some of them are very brave people who spy against very bad governments and systems. And that's what Burton was trying to get across to us, because he recruited people who spied against the Soviet Union. And I think that was the right choice. The Soviet Union was not a force for good in the world. When you spy against a bad country, a bad government, bad people, I don't think that makes you a traitor. I do think that makes you a hero. And there were people who undertook incredible risks out of conviction that the Soviet Union was bad. And some of them paid with their life to help our country and other countries as well. So the problem, though, is that this idea, and this is where we have like Nathan Hale and Benedict Arnold too, we have heroes and villains in our history. We have the idea of this person's a traitor. All spies are traitors. Not necessarily. But that's the point is, so I'm sort of heroizing Soviet spies in a way that they would heroize American spies at the time, because they'd say the opposite thing is we're the force for good and you're not. Unfortunately, we live in the upside down world today where what's right is wrong and what's wrong is right. Good guys are the bad guys are the good guys. So this is a different issue that I think is important. It pertains to intelligence as well, which is the people who spied against the Soviet Union. There were people who did it for reasons like money. But a lot of them did it out of conviction, because by the time the late Soviet Union, people realized it was corrupt, it was evil. This was not a force for good in the world. People that spied against the United States for the Soviet Union, who were Americans, a lot of times they just did it for money. I'm thinking of like Aldrich Ames here and Robert Hansen. And yeah, there was some ego involved. But my larger point is, one of the things that worries me in terms of intelligence and our country is, so we've had issues with Snowden, Reality Winner, Jack Teixeira, the young Air Force guy who leaked information on, and Chelsea Manning. It's young Americans or younger people who lose faith in our government and our system. And, I worked for the government. There's a lot of stuff that's maddening for it. If you have any job for any period of time, you're going to have bad days, and you're going to have days where you're like, what am I doing here? And you might lose faith in the organization you're part of. It's different when it's a country, though. And it's different when it's our country. And so I'm concerned when I see, how people are looking at intelligence, how people are looking at the United States. Like, if we're the greatest evil in the world, find me who's good. That's the thing is, it's hard. We all have reasonable criticisms, but when it comes to counterintelligence, when it comes to the ways in which I think more and younger Americans going into intelligence could possibly be compromised because they're just taught all the time how rotten our country is, and they're going to go work for a large bureaucracy, and they're going to, at different points in time, feel unappreciated. I know I did when I worked for the government. You just have to understand, though, that when you leak that information, the people that you're leaking it to, or the other foreign country that you're spying for, have no good intentions in mind. For you, for this country, for your family, intelligence officers, the people who recruit, and Burton Gerbert talked about this, are very good at manipulating people. That's their job. Manipulate and lie. Again, this is the un-American aspect of it. Now, they might do it for good reasons in the case of American intelligence officers, but they are very, very, very good at eliciting information from people and getting people who might think they would never spy against their country to do exactly that. So again, I'm worried that more Americans are growing up with a jaded view of their own country. And if they go into the intelligence community, it's easier to compromise people based on that. And so I think there's an education piece here too. And that's something that, this is not exactly something I treat in the book, but I do it by still reinforcing that intelligence has served the cause of American liberty for 250 years. It's done it imperfectly and sometimes often controversially, but it still has served the purposes of American national security and liberty. And that's something that we need to remember and also hold it to that standard. Are you serving our liberty, or are you taking it away? As we talked about in the case of sometimes targeting minority groups or targeting people unfairly. So again, going back to a theme that we had talked about in the beginning, it's a balancing act. It's a balancing act that we haven't done well in the past, and one that I hope that my book will help us do better in the future.
We hope too.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about intelligence.
Thank you so much. I think this was such a great conversation. I know I feel more intelligent about intelligence now.
That's the goal.
Yes.
Thank you both. And your questions were awesome too, by the way. These are excellent questions. It shows a level of interest in intelligence. And I'll end on one note too, because I had mentioned Burton Gerber. You can't fake an interest in people. When he looked to recruit future intelligence officers, he wanted people who were curious about the world, curious about other people. And he said, you can't fake that. And you can't fake it for long, at least, and probably not with someone like him. So I appreciate your questions, because I see how both of you, I'm a curious guy. I see how you're both very curious about the world. And that's a great trait for intelligence.
A huge thank you to Jeff for his insights on the hidden history of American intelligence. Through his work, we're reminded that what happens behind closed doors doesn't just stay there. It shapes policies, rights, and the way we live. If today's conversation got you thinking, make sure to check out and pick up his book, The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence. It's available wherever books are sold, and we'll also have a link to it in the episode's show notes.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. Follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until then.